Why hello my fellow apes, I hope you're well. In a recent video I expressed what I consider to be the 3 biggest mistakes made by atheists, and towards the end I revealed a potential mistake that I had to drop upon considering counter-arguments, and especially a specific reductio. The alleged mistake was moralising and politicising secular activism, that is, more than less, gatekeeping atheism, or put yet another way, ostracising secularists and atheists who don't also endorse certain moral and political positions. Now, what I want to do here is analyse this phenomena from the roots up, as while it's not necessarily a mistake, it can be, let's say, problematic. Let's get to it. Given that the moralising and politicising of a disposition can be really quite difficult to recognise, let alone analyse once it's set in, I'm going to construct a potential future example of secular gatekeeping, and then draw correspondence with contemporary examples. Now, you might not agree with the specific hypothesis I'm about to give, fair enough, but the point I'm conveying, the phenomena I'm trying to illustrate, is that 2 completely separate positions can often interweave so comfortably as to exhibit the illusion of being synonymous. Consider veganism, a predominantly ethical position that in recent years has seen a boost in prominence among secular circles, due to such things as Sam Harris endorsing it, though not practicing it, Alex O'Connor and Drew McCoy both endorsing and practicing it, and I'd argue most crucially, many countries significantly improving their vegan cuisine. The Starbucks Beyond Meat burger, for instance, is damn delicious. I've had to do this take several times, but you know, things I have to do for YouTube. Now, at first glance, veganism appears completely irrelevant to atheism, and certainly secularism, but on closer inspection, it's highly compatible with both. Theism, and especially Abrahamic theism, asserts that there is a God, a creator, who has a special relationship with one of its creations, and that creation just so happens to be us. We humans, so they maintain, are created in God's image, no less, and as is ordained in Genesis and supported elsewhere, we are given dominion over all other animals. Indeed, the holy books clearly permit the commodification of other creatures, with kosher and halal legislation going so far as to provide gruesome instructions of execution. In, I must say, a way that suggests an evil god. Now, yes, there are ways to interpret the holy books as to endorse veganism, just as there are ways to interpret the holy books as to endorse, well, pretty much anything. However, outside of bending over backwards, the books declare us as God's chosen. It is us that receive the commandments, and us alone. We can't kill other humans for taste, but we can kill other animals for taste. But what occurs when the illusion of divine favouritism subsides? When we no longer consider ourselves the universe's crown jewel, how then can we maintain the subordination of our sentient kin? As Marc Bekoff puts it, although other animals may be different to us, this does not make them less than us. In short, we need a new symmetry breaker, a reason, a justification as to why we alone are worthy of rights, respect, and love. Throughout history there have been many proposals, and some provide such a symmetry breaker, such as various forms of the social contract. But the most prominent proposals have upheld, more than less, the normative framework of utilitarianism, which can be summed up in the following sentence from Jeremy Bentham. The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And the answer to whether or not dogs, pigs, chicken and tuna can suffer, to name but a few, is most certainly yes. Hence, if well-being is the measure of morality, then dogs really are our best friend. In the absence of divine favouritism, the mistreatment of other animals is very difficult to maintain, and so the philosophy of veganism lends itself comfortably to secularism. Now, as it stands, atheist events are not excluding non-vegans, but given the trajectory and enough time, I for one can easily foresee a future in which atheist events not only exclude, but even disparage non-vegans. And if you're not convinced of this, then consider for just a moment that 20 years ago Richard Dawkins was the face of atheism, secularism and humanism, with him winning the Humanist of the Year no less. Today, however, he has fallen in the estimates of some segments as to warrant the retroactive rescinding of his reward. He is still the face of atheism, yes, but as things have changed, so too has his standing. Now, what I've just predicted with veganism is, at least as far as I'm convinced, precisely what's already happened with such things as multiculturalism and equal rights. The typical 17th century Enlightenment humanist views of Jews, for instance, is today considered utterly deplorable. But in any case, whether you see my vegan atheism hypothesis as a possibility or not, the point is that 2 completely separate positions can often complement each other so significantly as to be colloquially fused. And just in case I have failed to express the point, here's a real-life example. Due to Abrahamic influence, in the West we tend to think of religious people as people who believe in God, but this isn't technically the case. One can be religious, endorsing a supernatural world and afterlife, etc., without necessarily believing in gods. Alright, so with the vegan secularism hypothesis on the table, let's talk secularism. Secularism is the principle of separation of the state from religious institutions, and so, strictly speaking, so long as one aims to prevent religions from enforcing dogma through governmental control, theists and atheists are equally welcome as activists. But in reality, of course, the rate of secular endorsement among theists and atheists is weighted towards the latter, and it's chiefly for this reason that secularism is often conflated with atheism. But atheism isn't, of course, the only thing secularism is conflated with. No, not by a long shot. For instance, and as already touched upon, it's also largely fused with humanism, a stance that considers humans the starting point of philosophical and moral inquiry. And since humanism doesn't presuppose divine or religious axioms, it's easy to see why it so often goes hand in hand with secularism. Further still, and again as already touched upon, humanism isn't stationary, it changes according to objective and indeed subjective analysis. Empirical evidence of, say, complete androgen insensitivity syndrome causes us to reconsider gender. And to confuse things even further, each country's humanism isn't necessarily the same. Different countries inherit different environments and face different challenges. For instance, in the US, humanism and indeed secularism are deeply embedded with politics, since 1. The US has a relatively high population of evangelicals, and 2. The US only has 2 competing parties, with one being significantly religious. Thus, if you want secularism or humanism in the US, you've got one choice. Jean-Jacques Rousseau once remarked that those people who treat politics and morality separately will never understand either of them. And this is especially relevant to the US today. The US might be secular on paper, but goddamn are those evangelicals trying their best to overturn this. In the UK, however, the conflation of secularism and humanism with a specific political party doesn't really exist. In fact, secularism isn't really championed by any of our parties, and it's for this reason that many of us Brits raise an eyebrow when we see secular communities and societies endorsing all sorts of non-secular politics. Indeed, if I've learnt one thing from my travels, it's not to assume that because we speak the same language, we also share the same culture. We don't. The Anglosphere shares the same cultural foundation, no doubt, but each specific country's house is built with different material. From the very language we use to the hierarchy of our challenges, these often subtle differences go a very, very long way. Anyhow, let's talk about gatekeeping. Before making my prior video, I was very sympathetic to removing the gates imposed on secularism, since, I reasoned, if secularism is the goal, then barring allies out because they're not allies in regards to other moral positions is an act of cutting one's nose to spite one's face. It's counterproductive, and when practiced by a community that opposes religion, it comes across as extremely hypocritical. Excommunication is, after all, one of religion's favourite responses, and I couldn't, and still can't, knock the fact that when atheist and secular communities essentially excommunicate people for not maintaining, or worse, questioning the current set of humanist values, the ironic tribalism renders me quite frankly embarrassed. This hypocrisy is also, of course, one of the most prominent weapons swung by those in favour of theocracy, and so knowing that we're planting this weapon in their hands is really quite disheartening. The solution, on the surface level at least, is, of course, to cease purity testing. It's not realistic for me to expect others to share my views on, say, the economy, and then apply rhetoric as to paint those who don't share my views as monsters. However, if one is to hold a principle, one ought to ponder the most extreme consequences entailed by that principle, and it was by pondering the consequences that I changed my mind. Consider this reductio. If we cease gatekeeping secularism, then, when promoting secularism, I ought to be willing to positively share the stage with the likes of Stefan Molyneux. That is, I ought to be willing to sit next to him in a non-combative way, in fact, an endorsing way, as we both promote the virtues of secularism. Because, strictly speaking, when it comes to secularism, we are allies. But here's the thing. I wouldn't do this. I wouldn't feel comfortable sharing a stage with him unless I was in obvious opposition, and the reason is because I find many of his non-secular views deplorable. And this leads me to a slight side note that my spidey senses are telling me is worth caveating. There's a somewhat common sentiment that debating someone equates to endorsing them, and people have said this of me when I debated Molyneux and to a lesser extent Sargon, but this sentiment ignores the very obvious context. Engaging in publicised debate in order to criticise someone's views is the opposite of endorsement, it's explicit opposition. Yes, there are right and wrong ways to engage with people like Molyneux, but the notion that any association is endorsement is fanatic. Absent adequate rebuttal, the narrative that the left just can't handle the truth gets validated, and thus the rotten views are left to perpetuate. Alright, side note aside, and to reiterate, the reductio of not gatekeeping secularism would mean associating with people who hold all sorts of views that I find unpalatable, to put it mildly, and thus I'm not in favour of removing the gates entirely. But likewise, I'm also not in favour of raising the gates in accordance with strictly irrelevant views, since the reductio of this position is complete isolation, wherein nobody can associate with anyone else since no two people share the same views on everything. To be clear, both of these solutions offer a consistent framework, which is ideally what we'd like, but both entail consequences that I, and I suspect most people, are not comfortable with. So what's the solution? Is there a consistent framework that doesn't entail unacceptable consequences? As far as I can tell, at least as of this moment, the answer is no, not really. The closest in my estimation is basing it on personal preference, as this way one can conduct a utilitarian analysis of a potential collaboration and estimate whether it will overall serve their collective goals, which includes those that are strictly irrelevant to the specific event. But this analysis is compounded by so many factors as to make a truly objective analysis near impossible. Such factors that will have a heavy impact are, to scratch the surface, the specific views that the other party holds, the demographics of the audience, and the zeitgeist of both the local and cosmopolitan landscape. Further still, suppose that someone holds the goal of veganism with such priority as to not want to associate with anyone who promotes a meat-only diet. Well, if the organisers want that vegan, then just like that, they have to erect the gates as to bar out those who don't hold this strictly irrelevant view. So what I'm saying here is that while I don't know of a solution, I am fairly certain that we're dealing with a double-edged sword, and that no matter how we swing it, we're going to get cut. Now, as to whether or not this issue is as problematic as I consider it, I'm not so sure, but I can tell you this. I know of a lot of people outside of the atheist niche who, despite holding secular and humanist values, can't stand internet atheism, and especially US internet atheism. All in all, then, while I really don't like seeing secular communities turn their back on allies because those allies don't hold strictly irrelevant views, I also not only understand why secular communities do this, but, through my own actions, somewhat endorse it. Again, I'm well aware that my position isn't consistent, but that's the point I'm raising here. I don't see a consistent solution that doesn't entail unwanted consequences. Needless to say, if you have a proposal, then do let us know in the comments. I'm sure, at the very least, it will generate an interesting dialogue. Anyhow, before liking the video and subscribing, remember to mock me in the comments as an enlightened centrist, who's dog whistling to the right or attacking free speech. Oh, and as always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons and those of you who have supported the channel via other means. I sincerely appreciate your input, especially on the audio drafts. It makes a big difference to many of my videos, this one included.